My name is Ava Holloway. I'm 34 years old, and at 6:12 on a Thursday night, while standing in a hospital service corridor still wearing my badge and a blazer that smelled like stale coffee and antiseptic, I listened to a voicemail that should have shattered me. Instead, it clarified everything. My mother's voice was ice cold, polished, controlled, the same voice she used when she wanted to sound righteous in front of strangers. "You're cut off. Don't contact us again. We're moving forward without you." Then she hung up like she was delivering a verdict, not abandoning her own daughter. I stood there staring at the cinderblock wall while a janitor pushed a cart past me and a code alarm echoed somewhere down the hall. I didn't cry. I didn't call back. I replayed it once, then twice, because I needed to hear the contempt clearly enough to stop lying to myself about what my family had become. They hadn't just pushed me out. They had finally said aloud what they had been practicing for years. I was only useful when I was solving their emergencies, signing their forms, cleaning up their messes, and making their lives look respectable from the outside. The second I stopped being convenient, I became disposable. So I texted one word back. "Okay." By 8 o'clock the next morning, access was locked, a house deal was dead, and the first crack in their perfect little future had already split wide open. Before I tell you what she said next, and why their lawyer ended up begging me to pick up the phone, tell me what time it is where you are, and where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels before it hits someone who's lived it too. Here's what my mother didn't understand when she sent that message. She thought she was discarding the family disappointment. What she actually cut off was the one person who knew where every fragile support beam was hidden inside the house they were pretending would never collapse. I wasn't some ATM with feelings. I was the one who spent 6 years quietly untangling every financial emergency they created and then disguised as temporary bad luck. My background wasn't in banking or real estate. I worked in forensic compliance for hospital foundations and private care networks, which meant I was very good at identifying where money was supposed to go, where it actually went, and what happened when people thought a signature from a trusted relative could clean up a dirty trail. My family had never respected that work, but they loved what it could do for them. Over time, I became the one who reviewed contracts they didn't read, corrected tax exposure they didn't understand, structured payment plans they couldn't sustain, and translated consequences into language they could ignore. The latest mess involved a luxury downsizing move my parents had been bragging about for months, selling the old family property, rolling bridge funds through a temporary escrow arrangement, and closing on a high-end gated townhouse near the lake. They were telling friends it was a fresh chapter. What they weren't saying was that the bridge only existed because I had agreed, against my better judgment, to oversee the legal access chain, confirm source of funds documentation, and maintain shared authorization over 2 linked accounts until closing. Not ownership, not theft, not anything dramatic and illegal like the fake stories online. Just the very real kind of administrative trust people exploit when they assume you'll never stop rescuing them. At 7:43 the next morning, I sat at my kitchen island with my laptop open, my coffee untouched, and my mother's voicemail playing in my head like a metronome. Then I did exactly what a competent professional does when a hostile party explicitly severs contact while still depending on her legal cooperation. I withdrew my participation. I notified the title coordinator that I was no longer serving as verification contact for the source documentation package. I informed the broker, in writing, that I revoked my authorization to communicate on the transaction. I flagged the shared access credentials for immediate suspension pending identity revalidation. I also sent a short, perfectly professional note to the family accountant stating that any document previously routed through me would need to be reissued without my credentials, my review chain, or my indemnification language attached. No yelling, no threats, no revenge speech, Just a series of lawful withdrawals from systems that only functioned because I was in them. And then the consequences started landing faster than I expected. The townhouse closing was delayed within an hour because the seller's side refused to proceed with incomplete verification on a time-sensitive transfer. A restoration contractor my father had already hired for the old property put their move-out schedule on hold because the deposit confirmation didn't clear in the form expected. A private care facility my mother had been courting for my grandmother's temporary transition requested updated payment assurances before reserving the suite she'd been flaunting to her friends. That last detail made me go still, because it was the first clue that this wasn't just about another upscale relocation fantasy. They were moving my grandmother, too, and they had been doing it with a level of financial overconfidence that only made sense if they believed I would cushion every landing. By noon, the first call came through. I let it ring. Then another. Then 6 more. Funny how quickly "don't contact us again" turns into "why aren't you answering?" when the paperwork stops moving. Have you ever noticed that some families only believe in boundaries when they're the ones drawing them? I didn't hear my mother's voice first. I heard panic wearing my father's voice like a cheap suit. He left 2 voicemails before lunch, trying to sound measured and failing both times. There's been a misunderstanding. Then, 20 minutes later, you need to call us. Today. By 3 p.m., the tone had changed from strained dignity to raw alarm. The title company says there's a hold. Patricia says you pulled authorizations. I don't know what game you're playing, but this has to be fixed before end of day. I saved the messages and went back to work. I was reviewing an audit trail for a donor-funded oncology wing when my phone lit up again and again on the desk beside me, each vibration more frantic than the last. I remember looking down at the screen and seeing the family group chat suddenly active after weeks of silence, as if my existence had been restored only because their timeline was collapsing. That evening, I finally opened the messages. My sister didn't ask what happened, she accused. How could you do this right before the move? Mom is humiliated. Do you even understand the damage? There it was, the familiar family logic. Their choices, my fault. Their lies, my burden. Their embarrassment, my emergency. I almost answered, but then a voicemail transcription came through from my mother, and I read it twice because the hypocrisy was so perfect it felt scripted. She called me vindictive, unstable, and ungrateful in the same breath she demanded I fix the paperwork issue immediately. No apology for cutting me off. No acknowledgement that she had told me not to contact them again. Just outrage that I had taken her at her word. The part that changed everything came later that night when I reviewed an email thread I'd nearly ignored. It was from the care liaison at the private residence my mother had been using to relocate my grandmother. They weren't asking me to pay anything. They were asking me to confirm whether the funding structure previously described by the family was still valid, because the deposit had been represented as tied to proceeds from the townhouse purchase, which in turn depended on the old property sale, which now appeared to be stalled. The liaison was careful and professional, but the implication was brutal. My mother had been shopping around for prestige care she couldn't actually secure, without stacking one unstable promise on top of another. She had built the entire chain on my reliability, then cut me off as if I were the problem. 2 days after the voicemail, I had 58 missed calls, not 79, not some inflated number for drama. 58. And every one of them mattered, because each one marked the speed at which control was draining from people who had spent years treating me like a backup generator they could kick when the lights went out. The calls came from my parents, my sister, 2 unknown numbers, a broker, and a contractor. Then, at 8:17 p.m., I got the message that made me understand there was more at stake than a delayed closing. It was from a law office. Ms. Holloway, this is Graham Pike representing your parents. We have a serious problem and need to speak tonight. I stared at the screen. Then at the old voicemail from my mother, then back again. Serious problem. Those words hit different when they come from someone who bills by the hour. I typed back exactly 6 words. Enjoy moving forward. You said that first. Psych. Then I put my phone face down and let them sit in the silence they had tried to give me. What would you do when the same people who cast you out suddenly need your name attached to their survival? The next morning, I learned what the serious problem was, and it wasn't just a house. It was reputation, leverage, and the kind of paper trail people assume no one inside the family will ever expose. Graham Pike called again from a new number, and this time I answered because lawyers don't get theatrical unless something expensive is on fire. He was careful with his wording at first, almost annoyingly calm. He said there had been unexpected complications tied to the property sequence, to the assisted living reservation, and to certain statements made to third parties regarding available liquidity. I asked him to speak plainly. There was a pause. Then he did. My parents had already presented themselves to the seller, the care facility, and at least one social board as fully funded for a major lifestyle transition. My mother, who sat on the fundraising committee for a boutique elder care charity, had apparently leveraged that image everywhere. She had promised a sponsorship package, hinted at a hosting event in the new townhouse, and told people the family was consolidating assets smoothly. Except the liquidity wasn't smooth. It was brittle. My father had been carrying business debt I didn't know existed. My sister had quietly maxed out a joint emergency line that was supposed to remain untouched, and the old property needed repairs serious enough to scare off a price-sensitive buyer if disclosed too late. They weren't moving from strength. They were scrambling before everyone noticed. I asked Graham the only question that mattered. Did anyone forge my review or imply I was still overseeing this after I withdrew? His silence told me more than his answer did. He said some parties may have relied on prior understandings involving my role. That's lawyer language for someone got comfortable using my credibility after they no longer had my consent. My chest went cold then, not with rage, but with certainty. I told him I would communicate only in writing. He started pushing, mentioning family stress, my grandmother's transition, my mother's blood pressure, the sensitivity of the matter. I cut him off. A serious problem for them does not create an obligation for me. Then I hung up. The rest unraveled in pieces. A member of the charity board forwarded me, accidentally or deliberately, a draft invitation for a donor evening hosted by my mother in the not-yet-purchased townhouse. The event copy praised the Holloway family's continued commitment to dignified elder support, which would have been nauseating under any circumstances, but especially knowing my grandmother was being moved around like a decorative object in a branding campaign built on unsecured money. I also discovered that my sister had told multiple people I was handling the compliance side of the transition, a phrase vague enough to sound impressive and false enough to expose me if things went wrong. That's when the story stopped being about hurt feelings and became about self-preservation. If their fantasy collapsed publicly while my name floated around in the background, I wouldn't just be the daughter they used. I'd be the professional whose credibility got dragged through their vanity project. So I gathered everything. The voicemail where my mother cut me off, the timestamps of my revocations, the email confirming my withdrawal from all authorizations, the care facility's request for updated assurances, the event draft, the messages from my sister. I compiled them in a clean folder the way I would build any case file. Not to destroy them recklessly, to make sure the truth had structure if I ever needed it. That afternoon, my mother finally stopped pretending to be offended and showed me who she really was. She called from a blocked number, and when I answered, she didn't say hello. She hissed, "How dare you embarrass us like this? Not how dare you abandon family, not why are you doing this? Embarrass us." That was the center of her universe. I told her the embarrassment came from building a public life on promises she couldn't afford to keep. She snapped that everything they did had been for the family, that I was selfish, cold, impossible to love lately. Then she made the mistake that burned away the last of my hesitation. She said, "After everything we sacrificed, you owed us cooperation." Owed. There it was. Not love, not trust. Debt. The same debt they had been collecting since I was 21 and the first in the family to understand contracts, deadlines, and consequences. You wanted the villains to be clearer? This was the moment. Because the truth is, their cruelty didn't start with one voicemail. It started years earlier when my father borrowed from my graduate fund to save face on a failed investment, and I was told not to be dramatic. It deepened when my mother pressured me to skip a fellowship interview to help her stage a charity luncheon she wanted photographed for local press. It hardened when my sister cried on my couch about overdue bills, took the money I wired, and posted poolside vacation photos 3 weeks later. Every time I objected, they called me harsh. Every time I fixed it, they called me family. Some of you already know exactly what kind of trap that is. 3 nights later, the whole thing detonated in public, just not the way my mother expected. Remember that donor event draft? The one she was circulating before she even owned the property she planned to flaunt? It turned out she hadn't canceled the actual committee reception tied to that campaign. She'd only changed the venue back to the charity's historic conservatory and told everyone the location shift was due to logistical refinements. A mutual contact sent me the updated invitation with a single line underneath. "You may want to know what's being said about you." I almost ignored it. Then I read the attachment. My mother had been introducing herself to donors as a caregiver under extraordinary strain, a woman carrying both her aging mother's future and the burden of an estranged daughter who has chosen resentment over responsibility. She wasn't just privately cutting me out, she was publicly rewriting the story before the collapse could land on her. So I went. I didn't go in a red dress to make a scene. I didn't arrive with security or a folder under my arm like some soap opera avenger. I went exactly the way people least expect trouble to arrive: calm, early, and dressed like someone who belongs in rooms where lies are expected to hold their posture. The conservatory was full of glass, winter greenery, polished wood, and wealthy people pretending empathy over past champagne. I saw my mother across the room immediately, smiling with that charitable softness she only used when there were witnesses. My father stood near the donor wall looking 20 years older than he had a week earlier. My sister was laughing too loudly beside a trustee I recognized from a regional health board. Then my mother saw me, and for one perfect second, her entire face forgot how to perform. She crossed the room fast, teeth clenched behind a smile. "Why are you here?" she asked, barely moving her lips. I said, "I was invited into the story you've been telling." She tried to guide me toward a side corridor, but 2 women turned at the tension in her voice, so she kept smiling. "This is not the place," I answered, just as softly. "You made it the place when you used my name to hold your version together." That rattled her. She hissed that everyone already knew I'd been difficult, unstable, and vindictive since pulling support during a family crisis. I asked whether by support she meant my credibility, my labor, or the authorizations she kept using after cutting me off. That landed harder than I thought because my father, standing only a few feet away, looked straight at the floor. My sister rushed in next, all brittle panic and expensive perfume. "Can you not do this here?" she muttered. "Mom is barely keeping it together." I looked at her and remembered every time she had weaponized tears to outsource the consequences of her choices. "Interesting," I said, "because I seem to remember all of you being very committed to moving forward without me." She grabbed my arm. That was her mistake. Not because it hurt, because people saw it. A trustee turned, then a donor couple. Then one of the event coordinators, who already looked overworked and suspicious. My mother immediately changed tactics and raised her voice half a notch, just enough to sound wounded, not enough to sound guilty. "Ava, please. This is about your grandmother." That line was meant to make me look monstrous if I didn't fold. Instead, I said the quietest thing in the room. "Then let's talk about Grandma." Silence moves differently in rich spaces. It doesn't slam, it freezes. I asked my mother whether the care residents had been told the deposit relied on a closing that hadn't happened. I asked my father whether the seller knew the old property repairs were more extensive than originally represented. I asked my sister whether she had or had not told people I was still handling compliance after I revoked that role in writing. No screaming, no theatrics, just questions sharp enough to puncture the image they had inflated around themselves. My mother tried to shut me down by calling me cruel. My father said this was private. My sister started crying on command. But by then, the wrong people were listening. One trustee stepped closer and asked, gently but unmistakably, "Was Ms. Holloway not involved in the transition after all?" I turned to him and said, "Not after I was told not to contact them again. I have the voicemail, the withdrawal notices, and the timestamps if anyone needs clarity." My mother went white. Not angry white. Cornered white. She knew exactly what mattered in that room. Not morality, not family loyalty, but documented inconsistency. Within minutes, the board chair had pulled her aside. The event coordinator whispered to someone from legal. My father looked like he might be sick. My sister kept saying this was a misunderstanding, but her mascara was running and no one important was comforting her. That still wasn't the hardest hit. The hardest hit came from a woman I'd met only twice before, an older donor with the kind of money that doesn't need to raise its voice. She looked at my mother and said, very evenly, "Patricia, were charitable commitments discussed before your own household obligations were stable?" It was such a precise sentence that it sliced the room in half, because everybody there understood what it really meant. Had she been performing generosity with money she did not control, while her private obligations were held together by a daughter she had just publicly vilified? My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. I left before the spectacle could cheapen itself, but I didn't leave empty-handed. As I walked out, Graham Pike intercepted me near the coat check with no trace of his earlier composure. He asked if we could please resolve matters quietly. Quietly. Another favorite word people use when they mean before the consequences become permanent. I told him I had no interest in spectacle, only distance and accuracy. He said my parents were now facing the collapse of the property sale, scrutiny from the charity board, and a possible complaint over misrepresentations tied to a care contract. I looked at him and said, "That sounds serious." Then I took my coat and went home. Let me ask you something. When a family uses your silence as building material for their lies, is speaking up revenge or just self-defense at last? Public embarrassment didn't fix me. It didn't send me dancing through my apartment, healed and triumphant, the way cheap revenge stories like to pretend. It left me wired, nauseated, and unable to sleep. I kept replaying the scene in the conservatory, not because I regretted telling the truth, but because people like my family train you to feel guilty the moment you stop absorbing the impact for them. All weekend, my phone buzzed with shifting tactics. My father sent a text saying my mother's blood pressure had spiked and that, whatever this is, had gone too far. My sister wrote 3 paragraphs about trauma, loyalty, and how I was punishing everyone over a communication issue. My mother alternated between silence and brief, venomous messages implying I had destroyed my grandmother's future out of spite. Not one of them acknowledged the actual order of events. She cut me off. They continued leaning on my role. I withdrew properly, and their own false front collapsed under its own weight. I didn't go to therapy with a wise boyfriend who wrapped the lesson up in one sentence. I went because my hands were shaking when I opened my inbox and because I realized something ugly. Even after all this, some part of me still wanted permission to stop rescuing them. I met with a trauma therapist named Dr. Elise Mercer, and she did not flatter me with cliches about empowerment. She asked me one question that lodged in my ribs. When did your family first teach you that usefulness was the price of belonging? I sat there for a long time before answering. I was 13 when my mother started making me mediate arguments between her and my father because I was the calm one. 16 when I began reading loan paperwork out loud because adults in my house preferred optimism to details. 21 when I was told that delaying my plans for 1 year to stabilize the family was noble. 28 when I realized there would never be a final emergency, just a rotating cast of disasters tied together by entitlement. Dr. Mercer didn't tell me to forgive. She told me to document my reality so I wouldn't let other people narrate me out of it. So I did. I wrote down the old incidents I had minimized for years. The graduate fund quietly siphoned, the fellowship opportunity sabotaged, the temporary caregiving duties that turned into unpaid project management for every crisis my parents manufactured. The way my sister learned that tears could reroute money and labor in her direction faster than honesty ever could. Once it was on paper, the pattern stopped looking like family chaos and started looking like systematic extraction. Then came the confrontation at the old house. My father asked to meet, said he wanted one adult conversation without shouting. Against my better judgment, I went. But I didn't go alone in the emotional sense. I brought dates, screenshots, and a mind finally anchored to facts. The house looked half-packed and haunted. Designer chairs wrapped in moving blankets, art missing from the walls, cracks in the entry trim that had apparently been minor 2 weeks earlier, now impossible to ignore. My mother was at the dining table before I walked in, as composed as a defendant who still thinks charm might work on the jury. My sister was there too, red-eyed and furious. So much for a private talk. For the first 10 minutes they tried revisionism. My mother said the voicemail had been sent in anger and not meant literally. My father said everyone had been under pressure. My sister claimed no one misused my name, only assumed continuity. Then I put printed timestamps on the table, one by one. Revocation notice, title correspondence, accountant email, care liaison inquiry, event draft. My mother's public comments relayed to me by a board member. The room changed. Facts do that. They take all the warm ambiguity manipulative people hide inside and strip it for parts. That's when their real selves finally surfaced. My mother slammed her hand on the table and said, I had always enjoyed making them feel small because I was the only one who understood how systems work. My father snapped that none of this would have happened if I had simply helped the family instead of acting superior. My sister blurted out the truth by accident. You always act like the money was yours. I looked at her and said, not the money, the consequences. No one answered because that was the heart of it. They wanted access without accountability, image without solvency, dependence without gratitude. And then, buried inside a rage-fueled monologue, my mother revealed the ugliest thing she had ever said to me. She admitted they had expected me to put my own condo purchase on hold that year because someone responsible had to act like an adult. Not ask. Expected. She talked about my life as if it were family inventory, something to be reallocated. A room went very still inside me then. Not broken. Still. The kind of stillness that comes when the last excuse dies. I told them I was done. Not for a week. Not until they calmed down. Done. I would not restore access. I would not attach my name to any transaction. I would not intervene with the charity board, the care residents, the broker, or the accountant. If they wanted to explain their own misrepresentations, they could finally hear themselves do it. My father called that cruel. My mother said I was abandoning blood. My sister whispered that I'd regret this when Grandma suffered. I told them the person who endangered Grandma was the one who used her as social proof for a move they couldn't afford. Then I stood up and left while they were still shouting. The fallout took 6 weeks, and it was uglier than even I expected. The old property sale didn't just stumble, it collapsed after the buyer demanded deeper disclosures and a repair credit my parents couldn't absorb. The lakefront townhouse was gone within days, sold to another buyer with cleaner paperwork and actual liquidity. The private care residents withdrew the reservation after inconsistent financial representations triggered internal review. My mother was quietly asked to step back from the charity's Elder Support Committee, pending clarification of recent concerns, which in polished social language means the room no longer trusts you near its money or image. My sister's already fragile lifestyle cracked next. The joint emergency line she'd drained became impossible to hide once no one else was plugging holes for her, and the boyfriend she'd been impressing with curated luxury apparently had strong opinions about honesty once collection notices got involved. My father, who had spent years floating above consequences with tired dignity, ended up taking consulting work he used to sneer at just to stop the debt from snowballing. And my grandmother? That was the one thing I refused to let them weaponize. I did not swoop in and rescue the whole family. I did something far more controlled. Through a separate, documented channel, and only after confirming that doing so would not root me back into their financial circus, I helped secure a modest, reputable placement for her through a social worker contact unconnected to my parents' vanity plans. No luxury brochure, no donor dinner storyline, just safe care, honest numbers, and people who understood dignity doesn't require marble countertops and ribbon-cutting language. When my mother found out, she called me shrieking that I had humiliated her by downgrading Grandma's future. That word told me everything I needed to know. To her, care had always been image first, human needs second. What changed in me wasn't that I became hard, it was that I became unavailable for distortion. I stopped reading every message. I routed all legal or financial communication into a folder and responded only when necessary, in writing, with no emotional openings. I told extended relatives a short version of the truth before my mother could finish painting me as unstable. Some believed me immediately because, as it turns out, people had noticed more than I realized. Others didn't. That was fine. One of the strange freedoms of finally stepping out of a family role is realizing you do not have to win every audience. You only have to stop volunteering as the stage. About a month later, Graham Pike contacted me again. Not to threaten, not to negotiate restoration, but to ask whether I would sign a statement clarifying the timeline of my withdrawal from all family-related transactions. Not for my parents' benefit, for containment. The board, the care facility, and one lender all wanted the sequence documented. I signed a precise statement that did one thing only. It separated my name from their conduct. No embellishment, no revenge monologue, just a clean record. That was more devastating than any scream could have been, because once the facts were fixed, they couldn't keep smearing me as the cause of damage they had engineered themselves. Then came the last meeting, the one that could have turned this into a soft, recycled reconciliation story if I were a different woman. My mother asked to see me in person, not at a cafe with sunlight and wistful music. At her attorney's office because by then even she understood everything important between us now required witnesses. I almost didn't go, but I wanted to hear once whether she was capable of saying a true thing without wrapping it in self-pity. She looked smaller than I remembered, but not humbled in the beautiful, healing way people romanticize, smaller in the practical way consequences shrink people who thought they were exempt. She didn't apologize first. She started with hardship, how stressed they had been, how embarrassed, how much had been lost. I let her speak until she ran out of rearrangements and had no choice but to face the obvious. Then I said, "You told me not to contact you again. I respected that. You kept using what I built after pushing me out. That is why everything broke." She tried crying then. Real tears, maybe. But tears aren't truth. They're only weather. My father stared at the table. My sister wasn't there. Apparently, even she knew the performance wouldn't hold. Finally, my mother asked the question she should have asked years earlier, though not for noble reasons. She asked, "Is there anything we can do to fix this?" And there it was. The fantasy opening every toxic family hopes will still be available after they've burned through every other bridge. The magic sentence where the useful daughter provides a map back to normal. I looked at her for a long moment and realized the answer was no, not because I'm cruel, but because some structures should stay collapsed. You do not rebuild a house on top of a sinkhole just because the people who ignored the warning signs finally got scared. So I told her the truth they hated most. You can't fix this with me. You can only live with what you did without turning me into the repair crew again. My mother flinched like I had struck her. My father finally spoke and asked if this meant I was cutting them off forever. I said, "No, you did that first. I'm just refusing to crawl back into the opening." Then I stood, gathered my coat, and walked out of the office while my mother called my name in the voice she used when she expected history to reverse itself for her comfort. It didn't. The final update, for anyone wondering whether they ever truly paid the price, is this. My mother lost her committee role and most of the social capital she had built around performative generosity. My father sold the old house months later for less than they had bragged about, after repairs he could no longer pretend were cosmetic. My sister downsized fast and disappeared from the circles she used to posture in. The family narrative, that I was unstable, bitter, vindictive, never fully recovered once people realized I had been the quiet infrastructure beneath their respectability all along. Turns out panic ensues when the person doing invisible labor finally becomes visible only long enough to leave. As for me, I bought my condo that fall. The one they once expected me to postpone because someone else's mess mattered more than my future. I signed alone, with no group chat, no family blessing, no dramatic phone call. Just a clean pen, a clean title, and the kind of silence that feels earned instead of punishing. Some people think revenge has to look like shouting, public ruin, or one perfect line delivered under chandeliers. Sometimes it looks like documentation, boundaries, and the refusal to keep your enemies warm just because they share your last name. Sometimes the deepest revenge is letting people experience the full weight of a life they built on top of your unpaid loyalty. So tell me honestly, if your own family cut you off, kept using your name, and only panicked when the system stopped working without you, would you have gone back? Or would you have let them enjoy moving forward all by themselves? My personal view on this story is that it is not just about family revenge. It is really about the moment someone finally stops being the emotional and financial safety net for people who only value them when they are useful. What makes Ava's journey powerful is not simply that she got even, but that she chose self-respect, healthy boundaries, and emotional clarity over guilt and silence. The strongest lesson here is that love should not require endless sacrifice without accountability. Sometimes the healthiest and most positive choice is not immediate forgiveness, but protecting your peace, learning from the pain, and refusing to let toxic patterns define your future. Do you think Ava was too cold toward her family, or was this the only way to finally protect herself? If you were in her place, would you forgive them, walk away in silence, or let them face the consequences of their own choices? My name is Willa Bennett. I'm 24 years old, And the last time I stood in my mother's front hallway, she wasn't crying, apologizing, or even pretending this hurt her. She was pointing at the stairs and telling me to hurry up because her real priority was arriving in an hour. My half-sister had decided she was moving back home, and somehow that meant my room, my closet, my shelves, my whole place in that house had to disappear before sunset. I laughed at first because I honestly thought it was one of those ugly family threats people throw out and then walk back. But then my mother folded my winter coats into trash bags, and my stepfather carried my boxes to the porch like he was clearing out a storage room, not throwing out the girl who had lived there since middle school. When I said, "I pay rent here. I help with your invoices. I'm not some guest you can toss out," he stepped close enough for me to smell bleach and starch on his work shirt, shoved one hand against my shoulder, and said, "You're filthy, Willa. You don't belong in my house." I could have screamed. I could have begged. I could have reminded them who digitized their business records, who covered bills when things got tight, who stayed up late fixing the messes they never admitted existed. Instead, I picked up my bags and walked down the porch steps without giving them the breakdown they expected. 3 months later, they showed up at my door looking half dead with panic, asking me to lie for them before investigators locked them up. And standing there, watching the people who threw me out suddenly need me to save them, I realized some stains don't come out. Before I tell you what he said after that, and what happened when they learned I had kept more than my dignity when I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. When I left that house, I didn't go to some dramatic rock-bottom motel or sleep in my car. I went to the one person who had never once confused loyalty with ownership. Lena Ortiz lived over her uncle's bait and tackle shop in a cramped one-bedroom apartment that always smelled faintly like coffee, laundry powder, and salt air. She opened the door, saw the trash bags in my hands, and didn't ask me whether I had tried harder with my family. She just stepped aside and said, "You can take the couch, but if you cry on my good pillow, I'm charging you." That was Lena. She could make room for your pain without making you feel weak for having it. What made her different wasn't just kindness. Her own life was messy in a way that gave her real edges. She worked mornings at the animal rescue, nights at a seafood bar on the harbor, and spent every spare dollar helping her younger brother stay out of the trouble their father had left behind. She wasn't one of those perfect friend characters who exist only to hand out advice. She was exhausted, sharp, funny, and honest enough to tell me when I was slipping into self-pity instead of strategy. For the first week, I moved through my life like someone carrying broken glass inside her ribs. I still showed up at the Maritime Museum where I worked, still scanned storm-damaged maps and ship manifests into the archive system, still smiled at donors and retired sailors who wanted to tell me long stories about the Gulf before the casinos and chain hotels swallowed the coast. But every time I sat down at my workstation, my chest tightened. I spent my days preserving the evidence of other people's lives while pretending mine hadn't just been erased in a single afternoon. The only thing that kept me steady was routine. Log the item, clean the glass, adjust the scan, save a backup, make a second backup. At night, Lena and I would eat cheap takeout on the floor, and she'd tell me what happened at the rescue, or complain about a customer who tipped like a threat. And for 20 blessed minutes, I could almost forget the hallway, the push, the word filthy. Then the first letter came. Not a text. Not a call. A handwritten letter in my mother's careful cursive, folded into an envelope that smelled faintly like her perfume. That almost made me laugh. She had never written me a real letter in my life, but now suddenly she wanted the dignity of paper. I opened it at Lena's kitchen table, and right away I knew why it felt wrong. It wasn't an apology. It was a performance dressed up like regret. "You know how hard things have been," she wrote. You know your sister needs support in ways you never did. Then, a little lower on the page, I miss you every morning when I look at the hall and realize how quiet it is without your help. Not you, your help. There it was in black ink. Even when she reached for me, she was reaching for labor, for usefulness, for the version of me that kept their lives from wobbling. Lena read it over my shoulder, snorted once and said, "That's not guilt. That's recruitment." That same night, she asked me a question nobody in my family had ever cared enough to ask. "Now that you're not surviving their mess every day," she said, "what do you actually want?" I didn't answer right away because I hadn't let myself think in that direction for years. But eventually, I admitted the truth. I wanted to move up at the museum, not just stay the girl who scanned old documents. I wanted certification in collections preservation. I wanted my own apartment near the harbor. I wanted a life where my usefulness wasn't the price of being allowed to stay. Lena looked at me for a long second and said, "Good. Keep that, because they're going to come back the second they need you. And if you don't know what you're building, they'll drag you right back into what they broke." The second month after I was thrown out should have been the healing part. It should have been the chapter where I slowly rebuilt, worked harder, slept better, and let the wound scar over. Instead, that was when the story got uglier. My half-sister Brooke moved into the house and immediately turned my replacement into a full production. She painted the room, posted soft-filtered videos of her fresh start back home, and let people online believe she had come back to help our struggling parents hold things together. Meanwhile, I started hearing strange little things around town. At the museum, one donor casually asked if everything was okay, after that trouble with your family business. At the grocery store, an old church woman patted my wrist and said, "I'm sure your mother didn't mean what she told people." That was the first time I realized Denise and Ron weren't content with pushing me out. They were rewriting the exit. According to the version they were feeding people, I had become unstable, bitter, difficult. I had stormed out because I was jealous Brooke came home. I had been helping a little at Mercer Linen and left them in chaos because I couldn't handle responsibility. One person even hinted they heard money had gone missing. That part made my stomach go cold. Mercer Linen wasn't some harmless mom-and-pop wash and fold. Ron ran commercial contracts for hotels, restaurants, and 2 casino properties. And because he hated computers but loved control, he had leaned on me for years to digitize delivery logs, scan employee certifications, and build a cleaner filing system. I hadn't touched their servers since he threw me out, but my name was still all over old admin setup records. If Ron was laying a trail, he wasn't doing it by accident. The real trouble arrived on a Wednesday. I was at the museum basement archive, photographing rust damage on a Civil War-era ledger, when I got a call from Eli Perkins, one of the Mercer Linen route drivers I used to help with paperwork. He sounded like a man trying not to get recorded. "State environmental people came by this morning," he said quietly. "And somebody from labor enforcement, too. Ron's losing his mind. They're asking about chemical disposal, fake overtime sheets, and route logs changed after the fact. Your old login got mentioned." For a second I couldn't speak. Then every tiny rumor, every sideways comment, every weird look I'd been getting around town clicked together into a shape I could finally see. They weren't just trashing my name to soothe their egos. They were warming it up for the fire. When I got off the call, I didn't cry. I did what I do when I'm frightened. I started making a timeline. Dates I had moved out, dates Brooke moved in, dates of the first rumors, the letter from my mother, the call from Eli. Then I remembered something Ron had mocked me for years earlier when I digitized their system. He said I treated their linen company like the Library of Congress because I insisted on mirrored backups and automatic archive logs. He never understood why I built them that way. I did it because paper gets wet, files get deleted, men in a hurry lie. I still had old implementation notes on an external drive, plus system notifications that had continued routing to a secondary email folder because Ron never paid to migrate the admin account properly. I opened that folder that night, expecting maybe a few harmless automated reminders. Instead, I found 3 months of flagged activity. Route entries edited after midnight, disposal manifests overwritten, employee safety certificates uploaded and replaced, and a chain of failed login attempts tied to my old credentials after the date I was kicked out. That was the moment the story changed for me. Up until then, I'd been trying to survive what they had done. After that, I started preparing to prove what they were doing. Lena came home after her late shift, found me sitting cross-legged on the floor with printouts spread around me like a crime wall, and asked one question: "How bad?" I looked up at her and said, "Bad enough that they're not just liars, they're scared." She crouched beside me, skimmed the pages, and said, "Then stop playing defense." She was right. If they wanted to turn me into a shield, I needed to become a witness instead. I didn't go back to that house because of curiosity. I went back because I needed 2 things that actually mattered: my passport from the lockbox in my old closet, and the portable drive with the original system setup files Ron had never realized I kept duplicates of. I chose a Sunday afternoon because Ron usually went to the plant then, Denise usually stayed home, organizing, and Brooke treated the weekend like a personal photo shoot. I told Lena where I was going, left my location on, and drove there with my jaw tight the whole way. The house looked almost identical from the outside, which somehow made it worse. Same porch swing, same dying fern by the steps, same front door I had walked through 1,000 times before I learned love in that place was conditional. Brooke answered first. She was wearing one of my mother's cardigans and the expression people get when they think they've won something permanent. For a split second, she looked almost nervous. Then that disappeared under a smirk. "Well," she said, "look who finally came home." I told her I wasn't there to see her and stepped inside before she could turn it into theater. My old room was unrecognizable. New paint, ring light, vanity table, my museum posters gone. The shelf my grandfather built shoved into the garage. I stood there for a second, not because I wanted the room back, but because I needed to register what kind of people could erase someone that fast and still call it family. My mother appeared in the hallway, all soft voice and wounded eyes. "Willa," she said, "if you'd just called—" I cut her off. "I'm here for my documents and my hard drive. That's it." The softness vanished from her face almost instantly. That was always the thing with Denise. Her warmth lasted exactly as long as obedience did. While I went through the closet bins they had shoved into the back, she started talking in careful circles, about stress, about misunderstandings, about how Ron had been under attack by people who didn't understand business. Then she slid closer to the real point. "They're asking about the record system," she said. "Your name is still on some of it. If anyone contacts you, you need to make it clear you were the one handling edits from home for a while, just until we sort this out." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because hearing the ask out loud made something inside me snap into focus. She wasn't inviting me back. She was assigning me blame. I found the passport. I found the hard drive. Then Ron walked in from the back porch and the temperature in the whole house seemed to drop. He had that look he gets when he's scared but trying to wear it as anger. "You shouldn't be here," he said. I held up the drive. "Funny, I thought I didn't belong in your house." He stopped a few feet away, studying my face like he was trying to decide whether to threaten me or bargain with me. In the end, he tried both. He said investigators were fishing. He said the company had enemies. He said I had helped with records and needed to stand by the family. Then he added, almost casually, "You don't want people thinking those after-hours edits came from you because you were bitter." There it was. The blackmail tucked inside the plea. I looked at him and realized he was counting on the same thing he had always counted on: my desire to avoid public ugliness, my need to keep peace, my habit of carrying what should have buried him. Instead, I reached into my bag, pulled out one printed page of archived login alerts, and laid it on the kitchen counter between us. "These are failed attempts using my credentials after you shoved me out of this house," I said. "So don't try to make me your cleanup crew, and don't you dare try to make me your cover story." Denise went pale. Brooke stopped pretending not to listen. Ron's mouth tightened, but he didn't touch the paper. He knew what it meant. He knew I had more. I walked out before they could regroup, and for the first time since that hallway, I didn't feel hurt leaving that house. I felt dangerous. 2 days later, the retaliation started. First came the whisper that I had been obsessed with Mercer Linen's records after being kicked out. Then someone sent the museum director an anonymous email implying I had been fired from family work for dishonesty. Then Brooke posted one of those vague, self-righteous stories people use when they want to smear somebody without using their name. Some women destroy their own families, then cry victim when the truth catches up. She paired it with a sad song clip and a selfie in my old room. If she had been stupid alone, I might have ignored it. But she wasn't acting alone. Ron was building pressure from every side, hoping shame would do what force no longer could. The worst part came Friday morning, when I got a formal call from an environmental investigator asking if I would answer questions voluntarily before they issued subpoenas. By then, I already knew enough to guess the outline. Mercer Linen had been dumping solvent-contaminated waste into a service drain behind the plant and falsifying disposal paperwork to make it look like licensed pickups had happened. At the same time, Ron had been manipulating route and payroll records to hide unpaid overtime and missing cash withdrawals. My old admin account had been used in the edit chain because he thought my name would make a better sacrifice than his. He was wrong in 2 ways. First, I wasn't going to break. Second, I was an archivist. I don't just remember things, I preserve them. That afternoon, I met the investigator in a Plain County office that smelled like copier toner and old coffee. I brought a binder, a flash drive, and every ounce of calm I had. I explained how I had originally built the company's digital filing structure, how mirrored backups worked, how archive logs tracked document replacement, and why the timing of the edits mattered. I handed over copies of automated notifications, my move-out timeline, screenshots of Brooke's fresh start posts that helped establish when I no longer had house access, and the letter from my mother asking me to support them without once denying what they were asking. Then I gave them the system notes Ron had laughed at when I first wrote them, including one feature he never understood: background retention snapshots that stored previous document states before overwrite. In simple English, every time he thought he was replacing the truth, the old version had already been saved. The investigator's expression changed halfway through my explanation. That's how I knew this had moved beyond family drama and into case building. By evening, labor enforcement had also contacted Eli and 2 more drivers. One of them had screenshots of unpaid overtime texts. Another had photos of leaking drums behind the plant. Suddenly, Ron's version of the world, where he was just a hard-working businessman being targeted by bitter people, started collapsing under the weight of actual evidence. That night, they came to Lena's apartment. Not one by one. All 3. Denise was crying before I opened the door. Brooke looked furious enough to shake. Ron looked like a man who had spent the last 6 hours discovering walls where he expected doors. "Please lie for us," my mother said before I could speak. No build-up, no pride, just naked panic. "Please tell them you handled the edits and the manifest from home. Tell them Ron signed what you prepared. If you don't help us, we're going to jail." Brooke jumped in right after, saying I was overreacting, saying family businesses cut corners all the time, saying I was about to destroy everything over a few forms. Ron didn't deny a single fact. He just stared at me and said, "You can stop this." I looked from one face to the next, and something in me finally went still. 3 months earlier, they had stood above me on a porch and treated me like a stain to remove. Now they were asking me to crawl into their version of dirt and call it loyalty. "No," I said. Denise started sobbing harder. Ron took a step forward. Lena moved up beside me without a word. Then he made one last mistake. He hissed, "After everything we gave you?" And I heard my own answer before I even thought it through. "Your filth isn't something I can wash away." I shut the door in their faces while Brooke was still yelling. Through the wood, I heard my mother say my name like it could still unlock me. It didn't. Once official people started asking official questions, Mercer Linen unraveled fast. The state hit the plant first, then county environmental enforcement, then the labor side. Ron had built his confidence on the assumption that small-town systems move slowly and scared employees stay quiet. He hadn't planned for digital backups, overlapping agencies, and a daughter he had insulted into clarity. The illegal disposal records alone were bad enough, but when investigators compared those falsified manifests to root logs, payroll irregularities, and unreported cash withdrawals, the pattern stopped looking like sloppy business and started looking like deliberate fraud. Ron was arrested first on charges tied to falsified environmental filings and obstruction. The day that happened, half the coast seemed to know before lunch. Denise wasn't cuffed that day, but she was brought in for questioning and later charged with false statements and records tampering related to payroll certifications she had signed. Brooke wasn't facing jail in the same way, but her little online Fresh Start brand died overnight when local screenshots started circulating beside county case references and employee complaints. The boutique where she'd just started social media managing let her go within a week. The part people never talk about in revenge stories is this. Vindication doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like exhaling after being underwater too long. I didn't dance. I didn't post cryptic quotes. I went to work. I labeled a box of 19th century harbor photographs. I ate lunch with Lena in the museum loading bay. I answered investigator follow-ups when they came. And at night, I let myself feel what I had been too busy to name before. Grief? Yes, but not for the family I actually had. For the one I kept hoping would finally appear if I worked hard enough, stayed useful enough, forgave fast enough. My mother sent 2 more letters after charges were filed. The first begged, the second blamed. In one paragraph, she wrote that she knew Ron had made mistakes, and in the next, she accused me of choosing strangers over blood. That was the thing about Denise. Even at the edge of consequence, she still wanted the narrative to bend around her. I didn't answer either letter. Instead, I took the money I'd been saving in drips and starts for years and put a deposit on a tiny studio apartment near the marina, walking distance from the museum. It had terrible beige carpet and a stubborn window that stuck in humid weather, but the lease had my name on it, and only my name. When I signed it, my hand barely shook. Lena came with me on move-in day and brought a second-hand lamp, 2 chipped mugs, and a piece of cardboard she'd written on in thick marker. No free labor for people who call you family only when they need something. We taped it inside the pantry door and laughed until we almost cried. At work, my supervisor told me the museum would sponsor my certification track if I wanted it. "You're too careful for entry-level forever," he said. It was probably the nicest professional compliment I had ever gotten, and it landed because it had nothing to do with sacrifice. It was about skill, about my future belonging to me. By the time the first plea discussion started, summer had turned thick and bright over Gulfport. Ron's lawyer tried to float the usual story: overworked owner, bookkeeping confusion, one-time bad judgment. But the records were too clean for that lie to hold. Denise ended up taking a deal tied to the false certifications and avoiding the worst exposure only because she agreed to cooperate and accept financial penalties that practically gutted her. Ron took the harder fall. Brooke moved in with an aunt 2 counties over after the house went up for sale to cover legal costs and business debt. The room they once threw me out of didn't become her sanctuary after all. It became just another room in a house strangers toured with realtors. People around town started treating me differently, and that took longer to get used to than I expected. Some looked at me with sympathy, some with curiosity, a few with the kind of respect people only give you after they've watched you survive publicly. What mattered most wasn't them, though. It was me walking through my own front door at night without that old knot of dread in my stomach. It was paying my own electric bill because it was mine, not because I was preventing another household from collapsing. It was getting accepted into the Museum Preservation Certificate program and buying myself a proper desk instead of working from borrowed corners of other people's lives. A month before classes started, I ran into Denise outside the county building after one of her hearings. She looked smaller, older, less polished. For a second, I saw the outline of the mother I used to chase, and I hated that some part of me still wanted one sentence from her to fix everything. She opened her mouth like she was going to ask for something again, then stopped. Maybe she finally understood I wasn't available in that old way. Maybe she just knew there was nothing left to extract. "You could have warned me," she said at last, and even then, even after all of it, she still meant warned her that consequences were coming, not warned her she was losing me. I looked at her and answered the only honest thing I had left. "I did. You just only listened when it was too late." Then I walked to my car, drove to the marina, and sat by the water until the evening went gold over the boats. I thought about the girl on the porch with trash bags in her hands, trying not to cry because she still thought silence would preserve dignity. I thought about the woman I had become in the months since. Not harder exactly, but cleaner around the edges. More exact. Less willing to call self-erasure love. Revenge, at least the kind worth telling, isn't just about watching the people who hurt you fall. It's about refusing to go down with them. They wanted me homeless in my own story, disposable the moment someone shinier came home. Instead, I kept the records, told the truth, and let the dirt belong to the people who made it. And that was the part they never saw coming. I didn't ruin them. I just stopped standing between them and the mess they created. The antagonists in this story are disturbing not simply because they are cruel, but because they hide selfishness behind the language of family. Denise, Ron, and Brooke each represent a different form of manipulation: emotional guilt, intimidation, and entitled self-interest. What makes them effective villains is that they do not see themselves as wrong until consequences arrive. That is exactly why their downfall feels deserved. The positive lesson is powerful. Real love is never built on control, fear, or convenience. Sometimes the healthiest and most courageous choice is to protect your dignity, stand by the truth, and let accountability teach what kindness could not.